So this week's Torah portion takes a left turn from everything that's been happening till now. So up until now, from the very beginning of Bereshit, of Genesis, it's been a narrative, story, history, and all the way from Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, to Noah eventually, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his children go to Egypt, the Jewish people's slavery, the plagues, Moses getting the Torah. That's been the story. And this is 2,500 years of story, of history. The birth of a Jewish nation. So the birth of the world, originally, development until we have the birth of the Jewish nation. And that was last week's reading, the Ten Commandments. Now, we're at a point where the Jewish nation exists. The story pauses here, and in this week's Torah portion, we barely have any narrative, and we have law. So the Jews are standing at Sinai, they experience the revelation, they have the Ten Commandments from God, and now Moses descends from the mountain and begins to teach them the Torah. How much do they know? Very little. So some of the Torah they had in tradition from their parents and grandparents, because Abraham and Isaac, to some degree, intuited the laws of Torah, and so there were traditions in the family, there were values, culture that was passed through the generations in these people, the children of Yaakov, children of Israel. But formal mitzvahs, they heard the Ten Commandments from God, and that's all they knew. The Torah that we have is the next 40 years of development that they had with Moshe in the desert. And over those 40 years, Moshe taught them the Torah. Now, it's unclear, and there's a massive debate about this in the Talmud and through subsequent sources, if Moshe was taught the entire Torah originally, or the Torah that was taught over 40 years. Meaning, did Moshe receive everything at Sinai, just over 40 years expressed that taught it, or was it developed over 40 years? But we assume to some degree everything was taught at Sinai, whether in its developed form or some sort of seed form. Sinai, at Har Sinai, the Torah was given. But then Moshe had to go and teach the details, the specifics to the Jewish people. Right? Imagine a person converts, goes through a conversion, but didn't do any learning beforehand. And so on day one, where do you begin? They don't know how to practice Judaism, so they become a Jew because they've accepted mitzvahs. They don't know what the mitzvahs are yet. That's what happened to the Jewish people. God said, "Do you want this Torah?" They said, "Nah, seven ishma. We'll do whatever you say." God said, "Great, it's yours." But now they got to find out what is it that God says. How do we practice this thing? What does it mean to be a Jew? And Moshe starts teaching it to them, and the beginning of that is this week's Torah portion. And so almost the whole thing is just laws, law. Fascinatingly, most of it, at least the beginning of it, is civil law and social laws. And so the very first thing they're taught is how to treat their servants, is what happens, how to rule with damages, with the responsibility for people's objects. So how to interact civilly. The ritual laws come later. And so the very first thing they're taught, and that's an interesting discussion for itself, why this was the beginning. Why these laws are the ones that Moses started teaching them. But because it's a different style Torah portion, I thought also we'd do a little different style class. So what we've been doing here mostly is taking a narrative, a story from the Torah, from our history, and looking at what message this story has for our life, right? So sometimes it was metaphor, sometimes it was we relive the same challenges our ancestors have, and how they responded can influence how we should respond. But we were taking a story and learning from a story. But because this is more of a legal parsha, I thought we'd take one law and look at its application. Dissect it a little bit. see what it means a bit more Talmudic. We'd try to understand what Torah is saying in this verse. And the verse I chose is something which is a very incredibly important mitzvah in Torah. In fact, it's the most oft repeated mitzvah in the whole Torah. Any guess what it is? Without looking at the paper.
Washing your hands?
No. That was a good guess. So the mitzvah, or the concept is repeated 36 times, or according to one opinion Talmud, 46 times. Hi, welcome.
Hi. Thank you. Hi.
46 times is how to treat the ger, the stranger. It's introduced for the first time in this week's Torah portion, but it repeats itself over and over again. Don't harass the stranger, love the stranger, treat the stranger nicely, don't hurt him, don't damage him. It keeps every possible place Torah can throw it in. Again, we have how to treat the stranger. Incredible. And this week's Torah portion, the social laws and how to deal with others, starts off with that. And again, it's repeated at the end of that passage, how to treat a stranger. So it appears twice in this week's portion. And so when we read together the first time it appears, this first verse, and then introduce three questions that we really want to analyze in this verse. So this comes in chapter 22, verse 20. Just have the English here for brevity, instead of having 4 pages over here. I made it simpler. So it says, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You read that verse, and before you read, don't further in the sources, what do you think that verse means? Some head nodding.
It seems self-explanatory.
Right.
You should be nice to strangers, to put a more positive spin on it. Be nice to strangers.
So I think in the positive.
Because you were a stranger yourself. Your ancestors were.
Okay.
Don't take advantage of the expected weaknesses of someone who's not from here.
Okay. So you're adding a little more. That Torah, you're saying a reason why Torah would specifically target this law of strangers. Because naturally we would take advantage of them because they have a weakness. So Torah has to tell us not to. Which is a very, interesting point. We shouldn't oppress or hurt anyone. And that also appears in Torah. So what does this mean? Don't wrong a stranger. Someone who isn't a stranger I can wrong? No. A stranger you're more likely to wrong because they have a weakness, because they're vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So that seems pretty self-explanatory in broad brushstrokes. But notice that Torah uses 2 expressions here. Don't wrong a stranger and don't oppress him. So what does wrong mean? What does oppress him? It seems to be 2 different things you could do to this person.
I feel
They shouldn't.
A wrong is a specific thing that you do to one person. I think oppressing somebody, that seems more like a broader social phenomenon that one maybe group of people does to another group of people, for instance.
Okay.
And it also, to oppress is has more of there's a longer timeline versus you could wrong someone in an instant, but to oppress is it carries on and.
Okay, so wrong is sort of a one-off thing, and oppress is you have this long-standing policy against them. Interesting. So we'll see in a minute how Rashi explains it. But these are all valid thoughts. So that's the first question. What does the wrong and oppress mean? So William said in the positive, be nice to them. And we have that in Torah as well. Love the stranger. But here it seems to be specifically targeting 2 negative things you could do to a weak person, a stranger. The second question is, who is this stranger? What does a stranger mean? Don't wrong or oppress a stranger. Does that mean someone who I don't know on the street? We use the term stranger today. You tell your kids don't talk to strangers. So is that what we're talking about? Someone I walk into a random store? The manager of that store is a stranger. I shouldn't oppress him, I shouldn't wrong him, or is there some other connotation to this word?
It seems to refer to the state that they were in when they were in Egypt. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt.
Okay, so you're extrapolating it, which would mean what?
Which would mean foreigners in a country that's not their own. Right?
Okay, good. So a stranger then wouldn't be just someone who I don't know. They may be personally a stranger to me, but they're not a stranger to the community. They're not a stranger to society. A stranger is someone that doesn't fit in, right? On a bigger picture, not on a personal level to me. Someone doesn't belong here, which means they came from a different country.
Or someone who's not under you follow a set of rules. They're not under the jurisdiction of your rules or don't follow them, but they're still within the community.
Someone who stands out.
Would those be neighbors? Like, is there a distinction between love thy neighbor and don't do wrong to a stranger? The distinction is a neighbor is someone in the community who you may not know personally, but they're part
Yes, good point. The commonly quoted pasuk is love your neighbor, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And in fact, in that same passage in Torah, we have about treating v'ahavta ger. A few verses later, love the stranger as well. So it sort of seems to say, whoever this stranger is, it's the flip side, the inverse of your neighbor, re'acha. So neighbor doesn't mean necessarily your next door neighbor. Neighbor means someone who part of your society, part of your social circle, part of your community. Stranger is someone who's an outsider. They don't, for whatever reason, wherever they find themselves, they don't belong there. And so they're sort of self-identified, or at least identified by others as a stranger. That would seem to be the straightforward reading of the verse. But, like everything in Torah, it's not so simple. And I haven't quoted it here, but when we look at how this verse is treated in halacha, in Jewish law, it is translated as a convert. So the word ger in Hebrew means stranger in its strictest meaning, but it also come to mean a convert. Someone who converts, and the reason is obvious. A convert is someone who came as an outsider, wasn't born into the community, and became part of the community. So whenever we find the word ger in Torah, it's a question. Is this meaning a stranger or meaning a convert? There are a lot of work done to see if in Torah we can find, and it seems we can't find, a consensus when Torah used the word ger. Sometimes it means, the way it's termed in the Talmud, there's a ger toshav, which means a stranger who lives with you, not someone who converted. And originally was the Jewish people ran the government. Israel, they were self-determined, self-governed, and so it was a Jewish law. The Bet Din was the court that decided it. Go back to temple times, right? Or after, even before the temple, when the Jews conquered the land of Israel, they were the rule of the land. So how do we treat someone who isn't Jewish if we're running the country by Jewish law? And so you had a ger toshav, someone who had a legal status as a citizen or as a resident, but wasn't Jewish. They had to accept certain moral laws, the 7 Noahide laws, and they had to live up to that. But then they had equal status in Israel, but they weren't Jewish. And so often that's what Torah means when it says ger, stranger means, and that's the definition we were using here before, someone who doesn't belong, someone who for some reason isn't a part of your culture, isn't a part of your society. But sometimes it's ger tzedek, a righteous stranger, which means someone who's converted. And that's in a modern vernacular, and even as far back as the Talmud, the term ger almost always means a convert. So when the Talmud and literature from the Talmudic times looks at this verse, and when it's brought into halacha, into Jewish law, Maimonides quotes it, and almost all the codifiers quote it as being about a convert. That you should treat a convert with respect. You shouldn't harass, shouldn't wrong, shouldn't oppress someone who converted into the Jewish nation. Now, at the end of the day, we're definitely enjoying to treat everyone nicely, right? So we have to respect every human being. Of course, every single human being is created in the image of God, and it's irrelevant whether they're Jewish, not Jewish, live in Israel, live anywhere near us. A human being is a human being. So it's not sort of a practical level, who do we have to be nice to, but it's more of an academic level, or how severe it is to oppress this person. So Maimonides writes, for example, that we're told how to treat every single Jew and every person. So what is the point of this verse and all the verse about the converts? It says, you transgress 2 or 3 commandments when you oppress them. So you would have anyways been transgressing a Torah mitzvah, a verse from Torah, but you're transgressing now an extra one, which makes it more severe. A harsher sin, if you will. But actually in practice, the definition here isn't going to change the way we should treat people. But that is an interesting question of whether this means a stranger. There are some commentaries who read here as being stranger. But the sort of common accepted approach is that it refers to a convert. Yeah.
Does this mean, so you shall not wrong a convert or oppress him, for you were converts in the land of Egypt?
Great question. So Ricky hit the nail on the head. If the word ger means a convert, then the second half of the verse doesn't make sense. It says, because you were a ger in the land of Egypt. And obviously you weren't converts in the land of Egypt. So if we accept the halachic consensus that it means a convert, how would we make sense of the second half of the verse? Any suggestions?
Well, they haven't left Egypt yet.
Well, they left Egypt at this point.
What I'm saying is, like, they're converts in the fact that they haven't gotten the 10 Commandments yet.
So they're somewhat of converted into Egyptian culture. Okay.
Maybe I think it's slightly different, similar, right? They haven't received the laws yet. They're not converted to Egyptian culture, but they're not also fully Jewish yet, right? Somehow they're still at a beginning stage, and they're sort of becoming a Jewish person. Makes sense?
Okay. You have something, Teresa? No. It would still be, hard to say they were converts. What do they convert from? And what do they convert to? We'll see in a few moments. I think Rashi is addressing this. We'll read Rashi in a few minutes. And we'll see that I think he may be addressing that question. But we have this question, what stranger means, and it can mean a couple of things. That was the second thing we have to analyze in the pasuk. And the third, which I think is the most fascinating, is often we don't get the rationale of a mitzvah. We're not told why we should do this, or what should motivate us to do it. Sometimes we know we keep the Shabbos because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, we should rest. Now, that's an objective reason for the mitzvah of Shabbos. It's the reason why it exists. Why I should keep it, what should motivate me to keep it, is a good question. Right, this is a side point. In the 2 sets of 10 commandments, different reasons are given of Shabbos. This is not so well known. The classic reason is God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. If we look in the second time the 10 commandments are written in Torah, it doesn't mention creation. It says the reason you should keep Shabbos is because God took the Jewish people out of Egypt. And in fact, we say this in the Kiddush as well. If you look at the Shabbos Kiddush, we mention both reasons. We say because God created the world in 6 days, rested on the 7th, and we also mention because God took the Jews out of Egypt. Now, how is God taking the Jews out of Egypt a reason that we should rest on the 7th day of each week? So the commentaries have a field day. But one of the commentaries, Nachmanides, the Ramban, has a fascinating insight. He says that when you say a reason for something, there's two meanings that it could have. One, a reason for the actual mitzvah, so the foundation of the mitzvah, the rationale behind it. And one is a motivation. Why should I do it? The reason that I should involve myself in this. Right? You can come to someone with a great opportunity for business. And you could sell them the whole project. But then you have to tell them why it's worth it for them to invest in it. One thing, what's good about the project, and then why they should get involved in it. It sometimes could be the same argument. Often, it's going to be two different discussions. So he says, the objective reason for Shabbos is God rests on the seventh day, so there's an idea, there's a concept of resting the seventh day. But then the second Ten Commandments was Moses repeating it to the Jewish people. And he told them, you may be wondering, why should you care about this? Who said God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh? What does it have to do with me? He says, oh, God took you out of Egypt. You experienced the Creator for yourself. Of course you have to believe in creation. And so you have to respect creation by resting on the seventh day because God took you out of Egypt. You experienced it for yourself. Right? So you see, he says, you see two types of reasonings. When it comes to this verse, what form of reasoning is it? Don't oppress the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt.
The second one.
You would assume the second one, right?
Yeah.
We're not saying the reason it's wrong and immoral to oppress a stranger is because you were strangers in Egypt. That would make sense, right? It would seem to say, were we not strangers in Egypt, there'd be no problem oppressing a stranger. We wouldn't want to read it that way. So we want to read it the second way. Don't oppress a stranger because it's wrong. It's unethical. You're taking advantage of someone. But why should you care about this so much? How am I going to motivate you, the Jewish people, to upkeep this moral standard? Because you yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. Right? Everyone agrees with that's going to be the reading of this verse?
Mm-hmm.
But explain me that. Why, because we were strangers in Egypt, should we now not oppress strangers? How does that reasoning look? Can you spell it out? What's the argument? Any volunteers?
I mean, oppression didn't seem to do very much for the Egyptians. Ultimately destroyed their at least, God had vengeance on them. Right? There's a very practical reason not to do this because God may decide that your civilization is evil and then destroy it, as perhaps he does in the later biblical years with the Jewish people.
Beautiful.
Send to Babylon. Yeah.
Beautiful. So Ricky says, this is what the verse means. Don't oppress a stranger because you experience firsthand what happens to people that oppress people. Right? The Egyptians oppressed you. Look what happened to them. They were hit with plagues. Their civilization was destroyed. The oppressed came out on top. And so you, of all people, the Jews, from your collective history, you should know it never pays to use your power and abuse your power and oppress people that are weaker than you. Nice. Anyone else want to volunteer an alternative?
I thought an alternative might be you were a stranger and hang on, I gotta gather my thought. Give me a second.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
I had it.
So I think you mentioned something before. Yeah.
Please.
You wanna go?
Please.
No, again, an alternative path would be that again the Torah is trying to anticipate like what could go wrong, and that's how it comes with the commandments, right? So someone who was oppressed by someone else, maybe when they get out of this situation, they're going to do it to someone else, right? There is that
that
know,
cycle.
basically a psychological instinct that people say if someone did something wrong to you, once you're out of the situation, you're going to apply it to someone else. So, sort of a reminder, even though someone did something bad to you, when you're in a better situation, you shouldn't do. But like when you're able to do it to someone else, you shouldn't do it.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, fascinating. So what you're saying is, it's not a reason, it's not a motivating reason, it's part of the original injunction. Meaning, Torah is warning you, don't oppress a stranger. And why am I warning you so harshly? Why am I often repeating this? Why I keep telling this to you? Because you are likely to offend because you were strangers in Egypt. So you're flipping on its head.
They did it to you, and now you won, and now you say, okay, now I got the power, now I'm going to do it back
So
to you.
you're flipping on its head. It's not a reason why you would be nice to a stranger, but it's a reason why you might not be nice to the stranger that I have to warn you to be nice.
Right.
So,
Interesting.
I agree. So Raphael, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Now that I have some water, it occurred to me, similarly to Raphael, that we have a choice. We might be inclined to wrong strangers, having gone through the experience. We could wrong more strangers. We could say they were mean to us. Let's wrong everyone now. But perhaps to set an example, to be a light to the nations, we should do the opposite. So, like, for the sake of example.
Okay? Yeah. So we should ignore the tendencies, or we should work beyond those tendencies. And I think you mentioned before, William, in passing, the simple reading of the verse is that you were strange in Egypt, you know what it's like to be harassed. So you should feel for people. You should have sympathy or empathy for people who are weaker, for strangers, because you went through that. And in fact, we have in this parsha, in source number 2 here, where it says again, don't oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. So Torah seems to be spelling out a little more. It says, you know what it's like. You were in his or her shoes. Don't put them through that. You should feel their pain. You should feel what they're going through, and you should be the last people to subject others to that humiliation, to that pain. So these are the possible readings. We're going to see soon 1 or 2 more possible readings of this verse that I think are very interesting, and it can change the way we look at this whole law. But we'll get there.
Let me add another quick one.
Sure.
The Torah may also be talking to people that were not actually strangers. They're talking to you. Like you were never in Egypt. But the Torah is talking to you.
Right.
For the rest of the generations, right?
So how are you going to read it?
So you need that reminder because you were not there. So it's saying you because you're part of people that were once there. That's why you should be extra careful.
Right.
This is just me trying to push
Yeah.
to
Let's
find
look-
another way of looking
Let's
at
look at Rashi. Rashi, the chief commentary on the Torah, and he addresses a bunch of these questions we were talking about. So the first, Rashi says, what does it mean not to oppress? Not to wrong a stranger. Sorry, the first word, losona. Do not wrong him with words. Meaning, don't harass this person. Oh, who are you? You don't belong here. Where did you come from? Or tell people go back to where you came from. You're not doing anything. You're not harming the person, but you are humiliating them with your words. What's the second expression? Don't oppress him by robbing him of money. Don't take advantage of them either. So don't harass them, and don't take advantage of them. Those are the 2 expressions Rashi says of which, in addition to the explanations we had before, you suggested. This is Rashi from the Mechilta, from the Midrash. This is the double expression Torah uses. So don't say anything that could offend them. Be very careful in your speech. Be careful in the way you treat these people, even though, what did I do wrong? But even just, looking at a person who's disabled, or a person who doesn't belong, who's strange, you have to be oversensitive, because even if looking at them the wrong way, or saying something which you would have said to your friend as well, but since it can be interpreted negatively, they're going to take it offensively, because they're naturally more vulnerable, in a vulnerable position, you have to be overly sensitive in the words you use to these people. And then, of course, don't take advantage of them. Cheat them, they're not one of us anyway. I don't need to care about their misfortune. So, of course, I'm not going to steal from the store, but, I'll cheat here and there a little this person. I don't care for them. They're not part of my society, part of my community, not part of my people. Don't do that. That's number one. Number two, Rashi says, you are strangers. And here he explains, if you harass him, he can harass you by saying to you, you also descend from strangers. And Rashi quotes it from the Talmud and the Mechilta, don't taunt your neighbor with the flaw you yourself have. Or as we say in English, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. You're going to harass someone and they'll say, yeah, and where are you from? Your great-grandparents were in Egypt. They were also strangers. So don't make fun of me, I'll make fun of you right back. And here actually
now as we speak, by the way, in politics, right, when the president and others talk about, immigrants, then they answer from the left. It's like, you were an immigrant too, like 200 years ago.
So I want to stay away from politics here, but,
Me
but
too, I just wanted to
everyone
say
can interpret as they wish. But we're gonna just stick to the Torah here. But yes, definitely there could be some relevance with these psukim in how we look at border policy. The Rashi says something fascinating. He finishes off, and he defines the word ger, the word stranger. Whenever ger occurs in scriptures, it signifies a person who has not been born in that land where he is living, but has come from another country to sojourn there. Simply, if you read this Rashi without any other context, you would say, Rashi says, we had before debate what stranger means here. Does it mean any stranger or a convert? You would think Rashi is taking the first approach. Stranger means any stranger. But there are many who learn this Rashi, who Rashi takes the classic approach in Jewish literature that ger means a convert. But Rashi is answering the question that Ricky had before. The question is, if a ger means a convert, how is the fact that you were in Egypt, you weren't converts in Egypt? So Rashi says, even when ger means a convert, the word ger always means a stranger. Now, it can refer to any stranger, or refer to someone who is a specific type of stranger. So, in this approach, Rashi is saying, don't oppress the convert, because you yourself were strangers in Egypt. And so it's okay for the same word to mean different things. It always means the same thing. Stranger. Sometimes it means a specific kind of stranger. Sometimes it can mean any stranger. And so the first half of the verse refers to a specific stranger, a convert. But the second half of the verse refers to it in its broader term as someone who lives in a foreign place.
But the Jews who were in Egypt were presumably born in Egypt, yes?
Well, eventually. Originally they weren't. When the Jews originally came to Egypt, they were harassed from day one. They were called Hebrews. The term Hebrews came up then. Ivri means others. People who come from over, me'ever layam. People who come from overseas. People who don't belong here. And so, in fact, the Torah tells us when Joseph's brothers came to Egypt, the Egyptians didn't want to eat the same table as them. It was considered an offense to eat with the Jews at the same table, right? And that obviously has parallels in pre-recent history. So the Jews didn't belong there, and they were enslaved. Eventually, the children were born into slavery, but they were born into a class of people that didn't belong, right? So they may not have been immigrants themselves, but they were still an immigrant class. They were still slaves because of their original not belonging there. And especially us today, we're not in Egypt either. But we say our ancestors, they were there in that situation. They were there under those conditions. So Rashi takes it all from the Talmud, a lot of it, and from the Chilta. We'll look at the end of this next source in the Talmud. It's an interesting thing. 3 lines from the bottom, at the end of that line, It's Rabbi Nassan says that this, what Rashi quoted, that don't do to others what they can throw back at you, explains the adage that people say, one who has a person hanged in his family doesn't say to another member of his household, hang a fish for me. Which is incredible. I guess was a saying in those days, that if someone has been hanged or executed in your family through hanging, you never use that term even in regular conversation. Like, can you hang up my coat? You wouldn't use that term because then the word hang can have such a negative connotation to that person. And so you're oversensitive in its usage. And so that's how sensitive we have to be to the convert. We, who went through this as a people, we know how sensitive we have to be. We should never use terminology that could even remotely offend someone who is a stranger, who is a convert, because we know what it's like. We know those terms. Those terms are buzzwords. They're triggers, and we have to stay away from them. So that's just interesting how far it is, not only to offend them, but to say even use a word which could be taken in another context as offensive. That's how far we have to go to respect these people.
So even the term Garrett Tzedek or convert should not, as I understand, should not be used.
Oh, interesting. You're saying
describe it to when in conversation.
Yes, to remind the convert that they're a convert is even though it could be something they're very proud of, but it's unnecessary unless it's in a situation where it is necessary. But otherwise, they're a regular Jew, and no mention of the fact where they came from or how they got here should be made, because it could offend them, and it could have others look at them differently, and there's no reason for it. Once they've converted, they're 100% Jewish, like someone who's born Jewish. And so yes, even using that word when it's unnecessary could be an offense. Although some people would say wear it with pride. In fact, interesting, the Rambam writes in one place, Maimonides writes, that the reason we are told to love the stranger, love the convert, isn't only, as I said before, because you think not to, because our natural instinct is to maybe look at them as secondary, but because out of respect to what they've gone through, that they've become a Jew by choice, we have to give them respect. They've earned an extra degree of respect and admiration. And so therefore Torah says love the convert, because you have to give them extra love. You have to have more respect and admiration for what they've gone through and made a choice to be part of the Jewish people. So it could be, for some people, maybe a badge of honor more than something which could be offensive. So I'm not going to go through some of these sources inside because we don't have so much time, but they say variations of similar things, of what the reason, how we were in Egypt is a reason. So we mentioned a few ideas here why us being strangers in Egypt could be a reason that we shouldn't harass strangers. Rashi says they'll throw it right back at you, right? It seems very technical, like for your own good, don't do this because they have one on you as well. The Ibn Ezra here says, like I said before, you know what it's like. You've been there in that vulnerable position. You shouldn't hurt other people. The Ramban says very similar to what you said, Rafi. He says, when you were oppressed in Egypt and you cried out to God, God heard your voice. And we know God hears the prayers of the vulnerable, of the weak, of the poor, of the orphans, of the widows. And so you experienced that. And so no, if you oppress people, God will heed their cries and take it out on you.
No, someone else said it.
Oh, Ricky, sorry, yeah. Sorry. So that's the Ramban here. Nachmanides says that position. He says they're going to cry out to God, and God's going to hear their cries. Just like when you cried out to God, God heard your cries. The Or HaChaim offers a novel interpretation. And he's something very fascinating. He says, why would we harass a stranger? It could come out of a feeling of superiority. Where I'm part of this, I'm Jewish, I feel like I have this heritage, I have this spiritual self, a soul, I'm something unique and special, the chosen people. Anyone who isn't like me, you're from you're unholy, you're impure, you're whatever words you want to use about that person, right? You don't have the same distinct chosenness that I have. And he says, you look back, where did the Jewish people start from? You also weren't always Jewish. And we know that the depth of impurity, spiritual impurity, the Jews were in Egypt until God took them out, that they almost weren't deserving of God's mercy, of God to take them out. And so the Orach Chaim says, whenever you think that you're superior, spiritually superior, realize your origins. They didn't come from a very holy place. And to look around you, you think someone isn't holy, you have no idea. Right? Because who do you start off as? That's his perspective, how he takes it. And I think if you look at all these different interpretations, they are all saying along the same lines, but they're actually looking very differently at how you treat other people and how you look at yourself. Meaning, is it a technical issue that the weak person, the stranger, the convert, maybe has something wrong with them that you would want to point out, but we're warning you, don't, because you also have that, or they could get right back at you? Or do we say, your perceived look at them, what you think is something negative in them, you're totally wrong. What you may project onto the stranger or onto the convert is wrong, and you know it's wrong because you were in Egypt and went through it as well. When you were a stranger in Egypt, were you really inferior to the Egyptians? No. In fact, we would say the Jews were morally superior. So you know that just being in a position where others could subject you to being under their power, under their rule, where you are treated as a stranger, doesn't mean you actually have anything wrong with you. And so you should look the same way when you see a stranger. Don't look at them as different. Don't look at them as other, us versus them. Realize that they have as much going for them as you do. They may be different to you. But just because in your culture, in your society, they're a stranger, doesn't mean they actually are inferior. So not only that you shouldn't harass them despite their inferiority, but you should actually realize they're not inferior. Right? So it changes your whole perspective on these people. It's not just how we should behave towards them, but how we should view them. And it really comes from how we view ourselves. If we respect ourselves because of our achievements, because of the power we hold, because of whatever it is, our position in life, then others who aren't as fortunate or others who are different to us, we look down upon them. What I value about myself, with what tells me what I value about people, they're missing. And therefore they're invaluable. They are someone who could be ridiculed, who could be harassed, whether or not I actually do that. But if I view myself, what's my self-worth? My value comes from the fact that I'm a human being created by God, created in God's image. And I have inherent self-worth, irrespective of what I've achieved, irrespective of my social class and status, irrespective of how others look at me. I am infinitely valuable because I'm placed here in this world, because I exist, because I'm alive. I live and breathe. I have a purpose here by God. And if that's my self-definition, if that's where I get my self-worth from, I look at every single other individual and I say, well, they're also placed here by God for a purpose. They also have a reason why they exist. They have a story. They come from somewhere. They've been through things in life. They have things they're achieving in life in their own way. And so when we respect ourselves differently, we respect others differently as well. And so perhaps you were strangers in Egypt is a reminder to us that even though from an outsider's perspective you were the downtrodden, you were the second class, you know that wasn't true. You were there as you were subjected to the slavery. It's not who you were. As a constant reminder, realize everyone else, that's not who they are either. the homeless person you see in the street wasn't always homeless. Was born, has a life, lives and breathes, and even right now, they're here for a purpose. They exist. They're a human being as much as you are. So recognize that, and automatically you won't harass that person. You won't take advantage of them. If anything, you'll show someone who's vulnerable and isn't able to see their own self-worth, you'll show them more love, more respect, help them get back on their feet so they can be in a position to recognize who they are for themselves. And so, not only are we warned against harassing them, we're told to give them extra hand. We should pay extra attention to the vulnerable people, to the stranger, to the convert, or in the broader sense, to any stranger. Any person, the poor, the orphan, the widow, the weak, anyone, we should realize how infinitely valuable they are and give them a hand to be able to live that out in their lives, to be able to give them a chance to live that. There's a beautiful homiletic interpretation I want to finish off with, a Hasidic interpretation, that comes from the founder of Chabad, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe. And he's speaking about a different verse, but it connects right into what we're saying as well. In towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we have the curses. And there's a whole long list of things that will happen to the Jewish people if we don't follow God's will. And it's tragic. It's harsh. And some commentaries, read it into the tragedy that happened to the Jewish people later on in life. And they're really strong stuff. People will have to have no food, be able to eat their children. And the descriptions are poetic, but really tragic. And amongst those, we find a verse. This is the last source here. The stranger in your midst shall rise above you higher and higher, while you sink lower and lower. And at face value, what this is saying is, the strangers that don't belong there, they'll take over your land, they'll take over everything you have, and you will sink away. Right? That's the curse God has given the Jews. In your land of Israel, where it's supposed to be self-determination, supposed to be Jewish governance, you'll have others take it away from you, and you will sink into irrelevance. There's a Hasidic idea that all of these curses, all of these depictions of doom are really closet blessings. That everything that God gives is really a blessing. And these descriptions of such deep blessings that we can't appreciate them and we read them as curses. Now, what each one means, I don't know the interpretation for all of them. But this one specifically, Rabbi Shner Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, interpreted. And he says, who's the stranger referring to here? What's the definition of ger? So that's the godly soul that each one of us has. In every single person, there's a spark of the divine. We have a wholesome soul that it's untouchable, untainted. No matter what we go through in life, it remains wholesome. It's godly, it's divine. And it may have many layers of covering that don't allow it to express itself. But if we're able to really dig deep into ourselves, who are we? We're all altruistic people who want to do the right thing, want to connect to God, want to live for a higher purpose. Which is why many people live life frustrated. We think we know ourselves because of the years of the way we've lived, but inside of ourselves, there's this deep part that wants to live for something more, wants meaning, wants to connect to God. And that's the godly soul that we all have. So he says it's called a stranger because for most of us, it's a stranger. We don't know it very well. It doesn't fit into most of our life. It pops up once in a while and says hello, and that's, the extent of it. So he says this blessing is that the stranger will rise higher and higher, means will become more and more relevant, more and more apparent in your life. We'll get more screen time, more show time, while you, the rest of yourself, who you've developed to be, who you think you are, or the layers of defenses you've built upon yourself, that will sink lower and lower. And so, in a talk in, I think it was 1966, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe translate this also into our context. Says, why are we told to love the stranger? That's also meaning this, that allow that side of yourself to be. Don't oppress, don't harass it. We have this inner cynicism that anytime we have a little bit of inspiration, anytime we want to do something right, we laugh at ourselves, we're afraid others will laugh at us. Like, why are you suddenly being so altruistic? Why are you suddenly doing so many good, right things? Like, really, that's who you are? Who are you fooling? You're fooling yourself, you're fooling others. And so we push it aside. We oppress it, we harass it. We say, yeah, you really think that's who you are? You're a stranger. You're not me. So we bash, we put down that side of ourselves. And so what Torah is telling us is respect this stranger. Love this stranger. Nurture it. Give it more attention. And soon it won't be a stranger anymore. And that's because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Which means you saw that despite being in the most difficult land, in the harshest conditions of slavery, the Jewish people retained their integrity and eventually went out of there. Eventually broke free of the shackles of slavery. And so you know that despite being so covered over for so long, you're able to break free from even the toughest shell. Even the hardest nut can be cracked. And so realize that no matter how hard you think your nut is, your shell is, no matter how much you think the persona you've built for yourself, whether consciously or subconsciously, is, your inner core can always break free. It's possible. There's hope for you. That can become more integrated into your life. So don't think you're fooling yourself. Don't think it's a stranger. Don't push it aside or be embarrassed about it. In fact, you should nurture it, show it love, allow it to be there. And the truth is, this homiletic interpretation is not separate, not divorced from the literal interpretation. Because the more you respect yourself for that side of yourself, the more you see yourself as a godly person, as a person who's here for a purpose, the more you allow your divine soul to be who you are and how you see yourself, the more you respect others. Because every difference we have, what separates me and you, us and them, is always in external characters. It could be skin color, it could be way of dress, it could be gender, it could be politics, it could be the way we look, it could be our cultures, our beliefs. These are all things which we do, which are about the very thin external layer of self. But if we identify with something deeper, with a higher cause, with a higher being, with a more internal part of ourselves, we realize that we can connect with everyone. We all have that inner core. We're all brothers. We're all the same. And so the more we allow the stranger inside of ourselves not to be a stranger, the more strangers around us won't be strangers too. And that will lead to us not only protecting the strangers legally, not only in practice, not harassing strangers, but actually will develop in ourselves the respect for everyone, that strangers won't be strangers, won't be second class, and if we'll have that, hopefully will spread, and others around us will start seeing things that way, because it's contagious. When I respect people, people see that and start respecting people too. When I look at everyone a certain way, it reflects back. If I speak to someone with respect, they're naturally going to respect me and respect people more. And so the more we nurture this, it spreads to the world, and hopefully we'll reach a stage where everyone will live in peace and harmony. Everyone will respect all other people. And there won't be a need for this mitzvah anymore. Not to harass the poor, not to oppress the stranger, because there won't be strangers. Everyone will be able to look at each other and feel fellowship. So that's zoomed in to this one verse. So just to recap, we analyzed this pasuk, this mitzvah, 3 different questions we wanted to look at, 3 parts of the verse. Number 1 is, What exactly is Torah saying we shouldn't do? We saw it can mean a lot of things. Either, as Rashi says it, it means in verbally or in actually doing something against them financially. We had a couple other interpretations as well. What the definition of stranger is, we said it could be as specific as a convert and as broad as someone who's different to you. Either someone comes from a foreign land or extrapolated from that, anyone who's different. And the third question is, how is that we were in Egypt the rationale? We had a host of reasons. From what you said, that it's not a rationale, it's actually part of the reason why you might hurt a stranger, to reasons that we shouldn't, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, to the fact that we feel for those people, all the way to the fact, down to the Hasidic interpretation, that stranger doesn't exist outside of us, strangers exist inside of us. And that stranger is a positive thing. We should allow our godly soul, who often seems to be a stranger, respect it, show it attention, show it love, and that will help us, outside of ourselves, respect strangers as well. Until the point we see them not as strangers anymore, but as brothers, as fellows. Any further comments there? Shkoyach, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I add maybe a possible?
Sure, please.